With the announcement of the resignation of one of the most powerful governors in the country, we witnessed what women can accomplish when we assert our agency, even in the face of overwhelming institutional forces that are at work to suppress us. By bravely coming forward and detailing sexual assault and harassment and a toxic workplace, 11 women showed how formidable we can be when we speak with one voice. How difficult was it for the 11 women who took New York Governor Andrew Cuomo down? How difficult was it for them to come forward? And what does sexual harassment look like in the workplace? All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Sadly, 87 to 94% of all individuals who experience workplace sexual harassment never ever file a formal complaint. But based on the thousands of filings with the federal agency responsible for such complaints, sexual harassment is alive and well across all industries in the U.S. And although the 11 women who filed claims against New York Governor Andrew Cuomo don't appear to be women of color or women working in low-paying jobs, women of color and low-income wage earners are facing the brunt of the workplace abuse. Studies show that Black women disproportionately experience workplace sexual harassment. These women file sexual harassment charges at nearly 3 times the rate of white women, and they experience higher levels of retaliation for filing such claims. After decades of discussion about sexual harassment since the jaw-dropping Senate hearing testimony of Anita Hill in 1991 and the popularity of the Me Too movement, what is driving the high number of attacks against women in the workplace? Leading off our show this morning is my first guest, Kelly O'Connell. She is an employment attorney and litigator, and she is the founder of O'Connell Law. Good morning and welcome to the show, Kelly.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
You know, Kelly, I mentioned Anita Hill in the opening because you can't talk about sexual harassment and, workplace harassment today without remembering, and some folks may not be old enough to remember the really shocking and startling testimony of Anita Hill that she gave to a Senate committee, ironically, that was led by then Senator Joe Biden, now President Joe Biden, back in 1991. Help us understand why Anita Hill's testimony against then Clarence Thomas, who had been selected for a seat on the Supreme Court. Help us understand what the conditions were like then as it relates to sexual harassment.
Back then, women were growing towards breaking glass ceilings in the workplace and advancing their careers. And it wasn't a time period where women were necessarily believed, taken seriously. And on top of that, the general population didn't see a problem with a lot of the comments that were being said in the workplace. So even if they were to believe her, they wouldn't see it as a problem. And I think we've grown a lot more since that time.
Yeah, help us understand some of the major changes, the shifts that have occurred since 1991. You're correct. And I've been a labor and employment litigator for over 2 decades, and definitely the Anita Hill era, very different. Back then in the 90s and even early 2000s, women weren't believed, as you said, in the workplace. Complaints about sexual harassment were brushed off. Women were told to basically get over it. And men were allowed to maintain powerful positions, even though they were engaging in illegal conduct. But help us understand where we are today.
Well, today, I think a lot of what we're seeing is because of the Me Too movement. And because of that, women are being believed, they are more vocal, and so they're being heard by even more people. The media has taken up many more cases, and there's more emphasis on believing the victims versus being critical of the victims. And that's led to us taking down many powerful men. And with each man that has crumbled, I think it leads to the general population believing women even more, trusting in what they're saying, and being more critical of such conduct in the workplace and out of the workplace too.
So I want to talk some about what's happening with Andrew Cuomo. Obviously, arguably one of the biggest men in terms of his power and his position to be taken down by 11 brave women. But I'm hearing a lot on social media, some women saying, well, I'm not sure that what he did, warranted him, having to resign from office. They question the validity of the 169 page investigatory report that was prepared at the request of Letitia James. His lawyer, Cuomo's lawyer, raised a lot of issues with the report, saying that, they weren't giving access to the underlying documents. Some of the witnesses that were interviewed were not interviewed, and their testimony wasn't memorialized by transcripts. So a lot of attacks on the process and that actual report. What do you make of those arguments by Cuomo's lawyer?
I mean, they're allowed to have that say at this point. However, I think the investigation did what it was there to do and investigate these complaints, corroborate some of the evidence, and see if there's any foundation for these claims. And they can bring up their defenses at a later point, but it doesn't seem to have much standing at these early stages.
You've been involved in these workplace investigations, and it's important to note that Letitia James, the Attorney General for the state of New York, she went to Governor Cuomo and said to him, I basically asked for his blessings, his authority to open the investigation, and he gave his he gave his explicit consent for her to move forward with this investigation. So it's kind of ironic that he's now attacking the very report which he gave her, the authority to this investigation that he gave her authority to conduct. But help us understand, in your typical workplace sexual harassment investigation, how much information would ordinarily be provided, if any, to the alleged perpetrator?
It depends on where the investigation has taken place. Is it internal within a company or government body? Is it at a state level, with, for instance, New York City's or New York State's Commission on Human Rights? Or is it happening at the federal level with the EEOC? There's going to be different changes, but typically the person that's being alleged being the harasser in the case, they're not privy to much information until it goes public.
So you weren't at all surprised that the Letitia James's team didn't just hand over boxes and boxes of their investigation to Rita Glavin and the other attorneys representing Governor Cuomo?
Correct. It's very typical. And moreover, I think an even greater problem that he's having is by him allowing this investigation with open arms, and even in his resignation speech that we saw yesterday, he doesn't feel that what he did was wrong. There's even certain things that he's acknowledging that he did, and even taken in that light most favorable to him in his viewpoint. I still see a lot of problems and would still most likely guess, even in his viewpoint, that it's going to come down to it being found as sexual harassment if we were to go to court today. He doesn't believe what he did was wrong. And even in light most favorable, it's going to be unlawful conduct.
And I'm glad you mentioned, many millions of people watched that speech as he gave it live yesterday, and others I'm sure have watched it on the internet. And it was full of excuses. And some of the excuses were, him saying things like, occasionally I slipped. I now know that I said things that made these women uncomfortable. I didn't know at the time. I didn't mean to. He leans in heavily on this culture and generation theme. I mean, if you had to, if this was a sitcom or something, you'd say, what is the theme of it? And you would say, is generational differences and cultural differences. Help us understand why it's not a defense to sexual harassment claims to say, this is how we do things in our culture, whether we're Italians or we're, Irish people or we're African Americans or Latinos, or we do this because we're men over 60. Help us understand why those are not legal defenses to sexual harassment claims.
Well, the standard is unwelcomed comments or conduct. So matters what's the victim's perspective more so than his perspective. Because I mean, a lot of sexual harassers or even rapists, in their viewpoint, they're fine, but it's their victim's perspective. And here, his comments and conduct were not welcome. It was not invited. And I think if we were to be essentially a fly in the room when these events happen, we would see some sort of physical response, if not a verbal response to what he's doing. If he's groping a woman or touching a woman inappropriately, she's most likely going to freeze up, her face is going to go blank, or she's going to have some other sort of response if it's not just pushing him away. Even joking, he mentioned several times throughout this process and in his resignation, he was joking. I'm joking. It doesn't matter. The joke's not funny. It's sexual harassment in the viewpoint of the victims.
Yeah, and we just showed that photo. Let's put that back up, because another one of his defenses is that I hug and kiss everyone. That's his cultural argument, that, I grew up in this big Italian family and we're just huggers and kissers. And it's men, it's women, it's other elected officials, it's staffers. Is that ever a defense?
Not really. You got to read the room. For instance, I spent most of my adult life in Miami. We hug and kiss people on the cheek. It's a much more physical culture down here. But when I practiced law in New York, I sure did not go around kissing people on the cheek. I read the room. It wasn't accepted there, especially in a workplace. It's not something that's going to fly.
And help us understand the difference, because I think people too are sometimes confuse sexual harassment with other kinds of conduct in the workplace that maybe some people find uncomfortable, but doesn't rise to the level of severe and pervasive, which is the standard under Title VII for some conduct being considered illegal and, sexually harassing. So, give us some examples of conduct that might make somebody uncomfortable, but it's not sexual harassment under Title VII.
Well, it's going to depend on the severity and then the pervasiveness. So how bad was it, weighed by how many times did it happen? For instance, to me, on the scale, the most ultimate form of this sort of harassment would be rape. Once is enough. There's many other things that once can be enough. For instance, perhaps groping a woman, versus if he's going around lightly touching someone on the shoulder, kind of like a hello massage or some sort of less deep of a hug. And that happened on a weekly, it was weekly for months or years, that could raise to a level of pervasiveness to meet the standard. But even once is enough. It just depends on the conduct and the comments being said.
And you raised the point about, whose eyes are we looking through? Which lenses are important? And one of the things Cuomo kept saying was he didn't know. Like, he kept saying the line has been moved. Like, he was oblivious, which, was a kind of ridiculous argument given that he's governor, given that he has signed into law legislation as recently as 2019 that expanded protections for women who were sexually harassed in the workplace, given that he's responsible for providing sexual harassment training to the hundreds, if not thousands, of people that work in the state government in New York. But he kept saying he didn't know that things had changed. Is it possible in this era where we've been hyper focused on so many powerful men in the media, in entertainment, in business, is it possible, you think, that a man in his position wouldn't know what the standards are?
I mean, I find that a little bit ridiculous. Maybe he skipped out on these trainings. He didn't know what he was signing. I'm not going to say he's as bad as Weinstein or anything on that sort of scale, but still what he did was inappropriate, and I find it to be unlawful. So maybe he's looking at it through the lens of, I'm not a rapist. I'm not doing these horrible, horrible things I've seen in the news. I'm just doing this, and this is what I grew up around. However, what you grow up around, in today's context, like, he knew what was right, what was wrong, and he still chose to not modify his conduct.
And so what happens next for Cuomo? We know that one of the accusers, Lindsey Boylan, has already said that she plans to file a civil lawsuit. We know sexual harassment is a civil matter that's handled in civil courts, and you can receive monetary damages as a result of being sexually harassed. I expect the other 10 women will follow suit, and there'll be lots of civil lawsuits filed against the governor, the state of New York. What about some of those other people, though? Because sexual harassment doesn't happen in a vacuum. Typically, there are other people in the workplace that know about it. There are reports that have been made. And we haven't heard much about this, but perhaps there are other people that were involved in covering up, or we know that some of these women said they were retaliated against. Or is it possible that some other people in the governor's office will face civil liability as well?
Definitely, especially if there was retaliation and they told, for instance, a supervisor, and the supervisor afterwards retaliated against them. That supervisor is also going to be on the line. There could be potentially a lot of people who knew that are going to come down with this too.
And what about the criminal charges? We know that at least 5 district attorneys in the state of New York have indicated that they are, reviewing the investigation material that's been produced by Letitia James. We know one of the victims, executive assistant number 1, has actually filed a criminal complaint with the Albany Sheriff's Department. We've heard that sheriff come out and talk about an active investigation. Having practiced in New York, what do you think the chances are of criminal charges being filed against the governor? And what's the burden of proof on a district attorney that moves forward with any charges?
I'm not as familiar about the burden of proof criminally, but I do foresee that there's going to be several criminal actions being brought against him also, because while he said this wasn't political, or he tried to brush it off as being political, it's also political from, I think, for the state of New York, it's going to be the right thing to pursue criminal charges against him, because it needs to be shown that the state isn't going to handle these matters lightly, whether you're from the top or the bottom or anywhere in between.
And just in your experience handling these matters, how difficult is it for women to come forward and make sexual harassment complaints, particularly when you're making them against someone as powerful as the governor?
It's very hard. And that's why workplaces need to make it seamless for bringing complaints against harassers, whether it's the owner of the company, the governor, whoever it may be. Women need to be in a workplace where it's comfortable to bring these complaints, where they will not be fearing of retaliation, whether in the workplace or at home. It needs to be a more comfortable environment for women to make these complaints. Therefore, we can nip it in the butt, any sort of harassment, as soon as it happens.
All right, we've got to leave it there. Thank you so much, Kelly, for joining us.
Thank you.
Obviously, we're going to be watching what happens to Cuomo. We know some of the state legislators in the state of New York are saying the impeachment proceedings that were scheduled to go forward are going to continue. They're not going to end the impeachment, because he said he's going to stay in office for at least 14 more days. So we're watching to see what happens with those impeachment proceedings. Obviously, we'll be watching what happens with these criminal investigations from these 5 district attorneys. And no doubt there will be huge damages paid by the state of New York to some, if not all, of these women, because of the credible claims that were, outlined in that Attorney General's report. Thanks again, Kelly, for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
My next guest has actually been the victim of sexual harassment in the workplace. Lisa Wang is the co-founder of SheWork, she's also a technology entrepreneur, and she's sharing her story to help inspire other women. Good morning, Lisa, and thank you for joining me.
Hi, I'm excited to be here.
Lisa, what did you think when you heard the women, the 11 women, when they came forward? Or, we saw visibly 1 or 2 of those women have been speaking more publicly in the media. But what went through your mind as you learned about these allegations?
Honestly, at this point, I was not surprised. I mean, the Cuomo case it's a typical case of abuse of uneven power dynamics. This is the same sort of power dynamics we've seen in Harvey Weinstein, Roger Ailes, Bill Cosby, Larry Nassar, you name it. And really, in any situation where there are uneven power dynamics, it is very easy to take advantage of your position of power. And Cuomo, of course, has acquired decades of political power and respect and has that leeway to bend the rules. And if you look at just famous experiments like the Stanford prison experiment, it showed that no one is immune to power trips. Even when regular people are put in positions of power, they have an ability to transform into ruthless oppressors. And, even in the report, when I was reading it, I read that loyalty to the governor was highly valued, and sometimes even more so than the duties and obligations of one's work. And so any complaints or disagreements would lead to negative consequences. And I think when you have that sort of toxic environment combined with a powerful man who has a big temper, that can really subdue and suppress the voices of any employee who would fear speaking out for fear of risking their career, their image, their reputation. And as we've talked about, especially people in junior positions, women of color, women in low wages, it's when you have that environment and you're not empowered to speak out and there's a fear of loss, that's when these types of situations happen over and over and over again. And of course, having seen this happen so many times in the tech industry, and my own experience, just the first time remembering going to Silicon Valley, and even something as small as being assumed to be the assistant rather than the CEO of my own company. I call these the small paper cuts. And for women, it's everything from being overvalued, it's undervalued, overlooked, assumed as inferior. And these small paper cuts wear us down over time. So even by the time something bigger happens, it's almost this feeling of learned helplessness, of feeling defeated.
Lisa, I read your story that you shared it publicly in the media about an incident you had at a tech conference at a Starbucks. What happened to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that I feel like happens much more than we talk about. And as a woman in tech, most of the conferences that I go to, and it's getting better now, but still today, are primarily men. And being one of the few women there, of course, you need to network with men. You need to do what anyone would do at a conference. And I remember when I was pretty inexperienced, I was looking for investors at that point, and someone expressed extreme interest in my company and said, "Hey, let's go talk about your company." And at that point, you have a lot of hope. You're like, "Oh, I hope this person will invest in me. They see my potential." And I think a lot of times, men in power who see that power dynamic will exploit that. They see the hope, they see the expectation, and the long story short is basically he inappropriately touched me even in the public place, but I was able to at least assert my boundaries because it was public, and I'm very thankful for being smart about that. But I think it's the initial thing was just shock of being having my boundaries violated, and not knowing what I was allowed or not allowed to do because this was a powerful and rich man. So it's just one of those experiences, I think, that happens so often, and you don't even realize there's anything worth reporting, I think, in those cases, because there's this fear of being perceived as overdramatic or as crazy or not being believed. And that's what makes it even harder to speak up about it in that moment. And as well, being an entrepreneur, I'm not within a system. There's no HR. Mm-hmm. There's no one else to report it to. There's no systemic help or support. And so I think you're even more vulnerable when you are just an individual, when you're a female entrepreneur trying to make it on your own.
Yeah, I read a really startling statistic about the tech industry in particular. And tech, we're talking about technology, Silicon Valley, and other places throughout the United States that have large, tech companies, a lot of startup companies, that 48% of women report unwanted sexual advances. And we know this is a male-dominated, predominantly male field, changing, but we've seen some big lawsuits coming out of some of these big tech firms. Do you think that, in the last 5 years or so, since there's been so much attention on sexual harassment in the workplace, do you feel like some of these tech firms are getting the memo? Are things starting to change, and are things starting to be, a more welcoming environment for women?
I mean, first, I think that statistic is much higher. If you look at just across the board, even at the way police have been reporting rape cases, there is data that shows that police severely underreport rape cases and sexual harassment cases, and that when women do report, they're forced to relive those experiences in really uncomfortable ways and try to prove themselves. And so I think especially in tech, where you have women who are trying to make it and break through so much of this uneven venture capital funding, a lot of women are just not going to be willing to risk putting their careers and their dreams on the line. And so that's why I think, first of all, that statistic is probably much higher than what is truly reported. And I think, of course, the Me Too movement has brought a significant amount of awareness, and even, might I say, fear amongst men who don't want to have their positions of power threatened if they do something inappropriate. So, but, when we talked about even the way Cuomo shared his testimony, he didn't feel guilty, right? He didn't feel remorse. It didn't really show. And so I don't know if the awareness or the media attention has truly changed anything, or it's purely created a new system in which there are larger consequences to a man's reputation and his position of power if he were to violate those new codes of conduct. So certainly the stories they're not gone. I think what's been really, really powerful is having communities like She Works, having some of these other female entrepreneurial, female investor communities where women can actually come together and share their stories and empathize and support each other, and at least reassuring each other that, we can get through this together. That's what's been the biggest and I think most powerful change that has come from this.
Yeah, I want to bring into the conversation now Karla Altmayer. Karla is the co-founder and co-director of Healing to Action, an organization focused on ending sexual violence against women. Good morning, Karla, and thank you so much for joining us. What went through your mind as you heard about the allegations against Cuomo and saw the 11 women who were willing to share their stories?
Areva, thanks so much for having me. And, something that really came, I think one of the things that kind of stood out to me was there were a lot of headlines that said, well, this will be a test to the Me Too movement. Whether he will resign or not, or held accountable. And I think the thing that kind of stands out to me is that I don't see how the Me Too movement can be defined, or the success of the Me Too movement should be defined by the accountability of one man. It should be defined by the fact that women do feel like they can come forward and complain. It should be defined by the fact that they feel more powerful in sharing their stories in their communities. And ultimately, it should be defined by the work that is still very much needed to continue to work towards that cultural transformation, working towards a culture of consent, that culture of consent that has always existed, but has never been necessarily practiced until really Me Too has kind of put that in the forefront.
I know your organization works a lot with low-wage workers, women of color. And from my perspective, those women are often left out of these conversations. And so many of the cases that do make the headlines involve women who are in close proximity to powerful men. And many of those women themselves are pretty powerful. And not to diminish the voices of those women, because those women are very important, but we don't often hear the voices of women of color, low income wage earners. And the statistics and the studies all show us that those are the women that are disproportionately impacted by sexual harassment. What do you think we can do to lift up those voices and to, give more importance to those stories?
I think that's an excellent question. And I think one of the things that we really could be doing is listening to the voices and their stories already, because they have been speaking out. I think one of the misconceptions has been that these survivors have not spoken out, or they haven't talked about it, but they have. The challenge is that there's a lot of, if there's already allegations for these 11, women who had higher paying jobs, about the level of credibility that survivors and who are low wage workers is even there's even more of a burden to prove their credibility. And so I think one thing that we need to start doing is listening to survivors and taking their lead in some of the actions that they're doing to change these issues in their community. I think the other piece is, there needs to be a big investment towards preventing gender-based violence from the beginning. Many of the survivor leaders that we work with are immigrants who came from, different communities and different cultures, who didn't have someone to talk to them about concepts like consent or what is gender-based violence. And so for them, having been survivors, having experienced it, having now knowing this knowledge, they're seeing these issues play out with the next generation. Yeah. So for them, they want to see an investment in comprehensive sexual education, a deeper cultural shift around consent, and practices around that. I think even with Andrew Cuomo's statement of this is my culture, they are saying that was our culture too, and we want to change it. Yeah. And so those are the things that I think that can be heard and supported that are initiatives led by survivors.
Lisa, one of the things that happens whenever we're having these conversations about powerful men and women coming forward, inevitably there will be some women and men, a lot of voices that say, I don't believe these women. Why did it take them so long to come forward? And discrediting, and we saw Andrew himself do that, Cuomo himself discredit those women and the credibility. How do we know, in this era? For me, it's pretty clear, having done this work for a long time as a civil rights lawyer, but there are a lot of people who are asking, how do we know if these women are telling the truth, and are we to believe all women? Because, even though we know statistically very few women lie about sexual harassment. I don't know, the number is less than 5% or so. But there are some people out there who still think, that we should be challenging the women more. What do you say to those people?
I mean, if you just look at the statistics, on average, about 81% of women experience sexual harassment during their lifetime. This is not something that is fun to talk about. If it's truly an experience that you've had, it's hard to talk about it. So a woman who's actually finding the courage within herself to speak up about it, very, very little chance that she's lying about it because it's fun, it's entertaining. I think it goes down to, when this kind of thing happens, women are putting themselves on the line. We are risking.
Let me stop you there, Lisa, because one of the things Cuomo and his lawyer said about Lisa Boylan in particular is that she had an ulterior motive, that she was running for an office, borough president in one of the boroughs in New York, and her campaign manager was talking to people in Letitia James's office, and that somehow this was all tied up in her political aspirations. We heard, we've heard that before with some women that come forward, that they are pursuing some agenda, not entertainment, but maybe it's their own political agenda. Maybe there's some financial agenda, but there's some agenda. How do we, are we able to, without having a full, legal proceeding that happens in a courtroom, are we able to, in the court of public opinion, separate those cases?
I mean, the difficulty, of course, with these cases is always the he said, she said, right? The people who are in the room were the people who are in the room. Everyone else is purely speculating based off of what he said, she said. And I think, though, the patterns that we often see, honestly, around gaslighting, is that women their stories are manipulated and changed to serve the purpose of a greater patriarchal narrative that seeks to keep men in power. And so, of course, in my mind, they will find her ulterior motive. If you want to find an ulterior motive from a woman who's speaking up, you will find it and you will twist that story. And so I think coming from a place of what can you do to control, because each one of us has the ability to control what we choose to believe. This goes back to, why I started She Works. And I think it's so important for women to come together and have that majority voice that says, we believe survivors, we believe women, we believe, people who are coming out and speaking on their behalf. I can't necessarily speak on the legal proceeding side of it because that's not my background, but I've seen this so many times when powerful women come forward and say, this happened to me. And people will say, well, if you're so powerful, if you're so successful, why would you allow this to happen to you? And I think it's just a matter of understanding those sorts of psychological situations when you are shocked, you're really uncomfortable. It's not something that I believe people lie about.
Carla, I want to ask you about organizationally, how different organizations are approaching, how we end sexual harassment in the workplace, how we end sexual assault against women. And we saw one of the co-founders of Time's Up, which was started, created by Hollywood women in 2018 to respond to sexual harassment, that was taking place in Hollywood after Harvey Weinstein. One of its co-founders and a prominent lawyer, Roberta Kaplan, stepped down after allegations that were basically contained in that AG report, allegations that she was working behind the scenes, assisting Cuomo in attacking his plan of attack of these women. And I guess what happened is there was an op-ed that was going to be produced by one of Cuomo's assistants that was raising issues about the credibility of the women. And Roberta Kaplan was asked to review this op-ed piece and to weigh in on it. And survivors are livid. They're outraged. And they're saying, look, you got too close with the perpetrator and you betrayed victims. You betrayed the survivors. What are you seeing in terms of the different approaches to these organizations? Because one thing Time's Up did was they aligned themselves with high profile, high powerful men, or powerful men like Governor Cuomo, and they were successful in urging him in 2019 to pass a piece of legislation in New York that expanded the rights of women who had sexual harassment complaints in the workplace. So at the same time that he's using the left hand to sign this piece of legislation, the day after the signing ceremony, we learned that he sexually harassed one of the troopers that was on his detail. So this makes it pretty complicated when you think about how these different organizations are approaching this whole sexual harassment in the workplace. What do you make of that?
I think the first thing, there's two things that come to mind. The first is that while there might be organizations like Time's Up that, work to change the power dynamic or to bring power to survivors, ultimately at the end of the day, it's men and it's a patriarchal society that we live in that contains power and withholds power still. So as you mentioned, Time's Up was reliant on Governor Cuomo to pass this legislation. And these organizations that are led by women or are initiated as a result of survivor work or survivors raising their voices, it's still ultimately, at the end of the day, the decision makers who are ultimately men or people in power who don't want to give up power. I think the second thing that comes to mind is there tends to be a bottom-up approach, or there's a bottom-up approach to addressing gender-based violence, and then there's also a top-down approach. And while we commend the work of Time's Up to start this legal fund, to start the legal fund and to address this, at the end of the day, it really is, we have to be working with the people who are most impacted if we want to see changes at all levels of society. And that means doing the bottom-up work. That means investing in grassroots organizations that are connecting with survivors on the ground, that are listening to their stories, that are providing healing spaces, and are giving survivors their own, allowing survivors to tap back into their own power to then create change in their community. But only through that approach of really investing in bottom-up approaches like grassroots organizing, supporting survivors at that individual level, then that would then translate to these other levels of where women, where the norms would be changed because it starts from the bottom up.
And Lisa, I'll just ask you last question. We saw as a result of the work of, organizations working around this Me Too, movement, 201 powerful men were brought down across all industries. In this, a study was done and they counted all these men who lost their positions or were forced to resign. And about half of the people that replaced those men were women. So you'd have to say that was a pretty, the Me Too movement has been incredibly successful. It's both brought down men and has allowed women to break more glass ceilings because women replace some of these men. But where does the movement go now? From your perspective, what does Me Too 2.0 look like?
I think that change begins with education. It's sustained by education. And I think that it is so important to start educating kids from middle school and high school about the different types of sexual harassment versus sexual abuse versus sexual assault. This kind of thing is not black and white. And for so long, women's voices have been kept silent. We've been under wraps. And so I think that there's been this explosion where suddenly we are taking women's voices seriously. And in order to continue moving it forward, we have to make clear just boundaries around education. We need to revamp trainings and policies, have annual trainings at companies enforcing the rules, making these trainings interactive, not just a skippable PDF or a video. I think there has to be systemic change, and that begins at the educational level as well as at the institutional level, at the company level. And now it's not just women's responsibility. I think too often we bear the burden of having to move things forward. And now we need real allies to come forward. We need institutions to support the movement and make sure that this doesn't just remain a moment of time, but actually true change in society.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Unfortunately, women are, the oppressed and then expected to teach the oppressor how not to oppress us. In so many situations that occurs, whether it's race relations or gender-based relations. And clearly so much more to be done. But I want to thank you for the work that you're doing, Lisa, as well as you, Karla, and thank you both for joining me this morning. Continue to be a voice for the women in tech and definitely those low-income and women of color. We need your voices. Thanks again.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
We've been talking a lot about Cuomo, but what's driving powerful men like him to engage in this kind of conduct, particularly when he has witnessed so many other men in similar positions lose their jobs, lose their fortunes, sully their reputations? And then what about the women? Not nearly enough conversation going on in this country about the impact of sexual harassment, sexual assault on women. My next guest can help us understand these power dynamics as well as the psychology of perpetrators and the psychological impact on victims. Joining me is Dr. Carole Liberman. She is a Beverly Hills forensic psychiatrist and author. And back with us today is Dr. Earl Turner. He's also a psychologist that works with a lot of women who are the victims of sexual harassment. Good morning, Dr. Liberman, and welcome back to the show, Dr. Turner. I want to start with you, Dr. Liberman. Just real simple question. What makes men sexually harass women when they know if they get caught, everything is on the line and they can lose it all?
Well, the men who are the sexual harassers, first of all, most of them don't expect to get caught. It's kind of a superficially, they think they are wonderful. They have these, they're narcissistic. They have these amazing egos, but underneath they need the reassurance. It's men who continue to need reassurance that they are attractive, that they, that women find them attractive, especially for example, with Cuomo, younger women. So, they're not really thinking about getting caught. They're just thinking about wanting to have the good feeling of having this woman look at them or, hug them back or some kind of acknowledgement that she is attracted to him.
And I would agree with you. The 2 decades that I've been doing discrimination cases, sexual harassment, sexual assault cases, definitely 10 years ago, powerful men didn't expect to get caught. They use their power to intimidate women, to threaten them not to come forward. But we have seen so many examples, Dr. Turner, from Bill Cosby, Harvey Weinstein, Roger Ailes, Bill O'Reilly, Charlie Rose, Matt Lauer. this notion that I'm not going to get caught doesn't seem to be a rational notion, given that women are finding their voices and they are speaking up. So if you are a man out there in one of these powerful positions and you've watched men from entertainment to government to big business, lose everything, is there not something in your brain saying, maybe I better cut this out?
Yeah, I think, part of the issue that we've sort of been talking about this morning is that society does tend to blame women when these incidents happen. And so I think that for those men, they oftentimes feel like women are not going to be believed in those situations. And so they may engage in some of those behaviors. And as Dr. Liberman mentioned, I think that there is some narcissism and some other psychological things that may be going on individually with those men and the power dynamics that play out in those situations as well. But I want to go back briefly to a point that Lisa mentioned around sort of this importance of like education. I think as a society, the way that we talk about touch, unwelcome touch specifically, that there's a gendered way in terms of, I think, how we have those conversations. And I think that also there are some cultural things that we engage in around unwelcome touch as well that, again, I know Cuomo mentioned in his comments but I think that as a society, in a lot of communities, we do have this idea about when you greet someone that you grab them, you hug them, you kiss them on the cheek, those types of things. But I think we have to think about context about that as well. That's not something that you necessarily do in the work environment. So like for my clients, like I know that I have clients that may be very physical. I don't engage in any hugging of my clients. We shake hands if that. So I think you have to also keep that in mind. But for some people, they don't make those connections when it comes to the types of behaviors that they engage in.
I want to go back to this narcissism, and I really want you, Dr. Liberman, to help us break down the characteristics of I'm going to call him a sexual harasser, a sexual predator. You mentioned narcissism. I want to run through a list of some other things that I've read about to just get your take on them. What about a sense of entitlement? Because as I was watching Governor Cuomo, I couldn't help but see, he was just dripping with male privilege. Some would even say white male privilege. What about this sense of I am entitled to do this because of my position of power?
Yes, absolutely. I've been, as a forensic psychiatrist, I have testified as an expert in countless cases of sexual harassment, sometimes for the alleged victim and sometimes for the alleged harasser. And, it's not, you can't really just believe all women, without having a trial. Yes, a lot of the men do feel entitled. For example, Cuomo, it took him a lot. Well, his father was mayor, but it did take him still work to get to his position. And so he does feel like now I am entitled to the fruits of my labor. That is part of it. But, one of the things that hurts women is that when there are these sexual harassment complaints, especially when there are more than one, when there is more than one woman alleging harassment, some of the women, like with Cuomo is a perfect example, some of the women have more credible complaints than others. And, you were talking before about like, how is the public supposed to, realize who's credible? Well, it's hard for the public because as a forensic psychiatrist, what I do in these cases is I have the woman come to my office or over Zoom nowadays for I do 10 to 12 hours of psychiatric evaluation. And that includes starting from their birth, going through their whole life and trying to and analyzing them and seeing whether there's malingering going on, whether there are really other things that are happening. Like a lot of times, it's a story where a woman was having a consensual relationship with a man. I'm not saying necessarily Cuomo, but and she expects him to marry her. And then, time goes by and he doesn't leave his wife and he doesn't marry her. And then she sues for sexual harassment. I've had numerous cases like that. Also, of course, the most obvious.
Let me stop you, Dr. Lieberman, because even in those cases, that's the concept of consent that we're talking about. I can be in a consensual relationship with you on Monday morning. Monday afternoon, I can decide that consensual relationship is over. And anything you do to me on Monday afternoon is sexual harassment, sexual assault. And
Yes.
we need to be really clear about that.
Yes,
Women
yes.
and men get to say it's over.
Absolutely.
It's no longer welcome.
Absolutely.
And at that point, the law recognizes that
Yes.
that conduct beyond the point at which you've said unwelcomed, that is illegal conduct.
Yes.
So the fact that someone may have had an affair or a relationship that was consensual doesn't prohibit them from being the victim of sexual harassment.
Yes, I'm not saying a case like that. I don't mean where there was something after the woman. Usually it's not the woman who says that she wants to end it. In those kinds of cases, it's the man who has shown her by his actions that he doesn't want to, that he's not going to continue, or she doesn't want to continue because he's not going to leave his wife in those cases. But I'm not talking about when he continues to try to harass her, but like specifically, in this case with Cuomo, the woman Brittany Camiso, who came forward and did the interview, I did not find her credible because, first of all, she, in her body language in her interviews, she had this sort of appearance of, just kind of like poor me kind of thing. She talked about when he's allegedly put his hand in her bra. She said that when she went into the room and he closed the door and she said, "You're going to get us into trouble." Now that's something that a woman says, when she's kind of inviting something to happen. If she was worried that he was going to get them into trouble.
Oh, Dr. Liberman, what do you mean that that's something a woman says when she's inviting something to happen? She's the executive assistant to the governor of the state of New York. Let me be clear about that. And in that 168-page report, the investigators found her complaint to be incredibly credible, and they found corroboration for her complaint. So when I hear you say her body language, I want to ask you, Dr. Turner, jump in on this. Is that the kind of thing that we've been fighting against over the last decades, is women somehow being sized up by an interview on TV? What we heard people say was she went and ate some crackers and cheese. So she couldn't have been all that distraught because she was eating crackers and cheese later. Isn't that what we've been fighting about for the last 2 decades?
Right. And I think, that really sort of speaks to the point that Karla made earlier about the credibility of survivors being challenged at times when these incidents happen. And so I think that it's really important for us to really recognize that when we think about sexual harassment and sexual assault more specifically, that there are different types of sexual assault. And so I think that the conversation oftentimes is around penetrative forms of sexual assault when it comes to things like rape, but we don't talk as much about non-penetrative sexual assault, which is the kissing and the touching and the fondling pieces. And we know that about 40% of sexual assault involves those types of incidents. And so I think that we do have to really begin to listen to the survivors and victims, because that then can lead to other difficulties for them psychologically in terms of not only how they are blamed by society, but how they also may blame themselves. And so we can think about, these behavioral self-blame that they may engage in, where they feel like, well, what did I do in this situation that sort of warranted these types of actions? Or there may be more characterological self-blame, where it's now attack on their character, where they feel like, well, I deserve this because of something that I did. And I think that oftentimes as a society, we oftentimes engage in characterological things when it comes to survivors related to sexual assault. And that makes it much more difficult in terms of the psychological impacts of this.
I do want to go back to those characteristics with you, Dr. Lieberman, but Dr. Turner, before I do that, I want to ask you about this notion that a lot of people have, that if a woman doesn't report the sexual harassment immediately, that somehow it didn't happen, that the failure to report it immediately is tantamount to it being a non-credible claim. Can you help us understand psychologically what happens to a lot of victims, why they don't come forward immediately sometimes?
Yeah, well, I think, going back to the point that I just made, that oftentimes they are aware that there is going to be some potential that people are not going to believe them, then they're not going to be seen as credible. And so they sometimes will sit with those things for some time before they do feel comfortable bringing those things forward. And obviously it may be the result of like the mental stressors that they may experience that may sort of cause them to ultimately say, I need to let people know about this and disclose this information because of the internal sort of trauma that they may be experiencing about that. And so I think that is a huge factor related to that. And when it comes to different policies in different work environments specifically, that also impacts people coming forward, particularly when it comes to some financial considerations about, am I going to lose my job? And I need to support my family. So that also may sort of be a factor related to these types of cases as well.
Yeah, and we shouldn't underestimate the power of numbers, because one of the things that Brittany Camiso said was that she was sitting at home watching Cuomo talk about these allegations, and he said he had never touched anyone in an inappropriate way, and it was her seeing the other women come forward that gave her strength, and we saw that with Trump, with Cosby, we saw it with some of the other, Harvey Weinstein in particular, where lots of women got their voice because other women came forward. So we know there's some power in that. Dr. Liberman, I want to go back to you, though, in terms of this characteristics of a sexual harasser or a perpetrator. Talk to us about sexual objectification and why, even in today's culture, some men still sexually objectify women.
Yes. For example, well, first of all, the men convince themselves that the women do want to do this, that it is consensual. If they have a lot of power, or if they have, they whatever their characteristic is that they would think, or they would want to think that women are attracted to, they convince themselves that in fact the women did want this. That's part of it. And as far as, and just to go back for a second to my point in bringing up Brittany was that some women who were not really sexually harassed, but who come forward, particularly in a public way, make it harder for women who were sexually harassed to be believed. That was my overarching point there. And that there were other things, other reasons why I did not find her credible as well.
Yeah, and you're entitled to your opinion. And I just want to point out that the investigators that spent time talking with her, observing her demeanor, talking to other people, collecting corroborating evidence, found her to be incredibly credible. And as to women that come forward to tell or make allegations, that's such a small percentage of allegations that are made by women that are not true. So we don't want to overstate that.
Yes,
that make false claims, because that just isn't the case. Overwhelmingly, it's women coming forward telling true stories, not being believed, being retaliated against. I want to stick for a moment, though, with these characterizations, these character traits. What is labeling? Because we saw that with Cuomo. And we saw it particularly with Bill Cosby when he used the word rendezvous. So men create in their minds these labels for what's happening that really undermine, the seriousness and the illegality of their conduct. Is that common in men who engage in sexual harassment?
Yes. It's all a part of creating in their mind a fantasy of what these things are, and without taking blame, whether it's because they believe that the woman instigated it or the woman wanted it or whatever, a rendezvous. These kinds of terms make it sexier. And that's what they want to believe. It's also interesting that a lot of men who eventually get into a position of power, they weren't men who were particularly appealing to women when they were younger. And now all of a sudden they think, oh, well, I didn't have a lot of success when I was in high school, let's say, but now that I'm the mayor, or now that I'm, a rap star or a music star, now I can get all these women. So it's like they want to go back and prove that, oh, yes, really I am cool.
Yeah. And Dr. Turner, help us understand the psychology of someone like Cuomo. And obviously you're not his doctor, you haven't analyzed him from a psychological standpoint, but he talks so much about his mother. During his press conferences about COVID, he constantly referenced his mother, obviously very close to his mother, obviously a lot of respect for his mother and his daughters. We learned about his whole family. And yesterday in his somewhat, mea culpa speech, which was more full of excuses than anything, He talked about wanting his daughters to have equal opportunity, wanting them to be in a workplace free of harassment. But yet he didn't afford that same level of concern to the young women in his workplace. So how is it that someone who is so close to the other women in their lives, women that he clearly loves, and wants them to be, in a workplace that's free of sexual harassment, yet can engage in that conduct? That seemed, like we're talking to a person. Obviously, people have layers, obviously, so I know no one's unidimensional. But what was that about? I love my daughters, but I don't care about your daughters.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously I don't know the details of his life and his experiences, and I'm sort of looking at this as an outside person. But I think one of the things that comes up oftentimes in terms of how kids are socialized around inappropriate touching, and I know he used that language often, that it wasn't inappropriate. So what is inappropriate? How are we defining that? And so I think that's something that we do need to do more of in terms of educating kids about inappropriate touching, what that is, also about unwanted touching. So grabbing someone or massaging their shoulder or kissing them on the cheek isn't necessarily inappropriate, but is it unwanted? And so I think there are times where for kids, we sort of force them to like hug a relative or something like that when they may not want to because they feel uncomfortable. I think we need to get out of those types of cultural things because it can potentially lead to some, further concerns down the road as they become older and adults, where they are having these behaviors sort of engaged in towards them, and they don't feel comfortable about it, and then don't know what to do because they haven't been taught that they have the right to make decisions about their body.
And just lastly, Dr. Liberman, help us understand the impact of women who have been sexually harassed. We talk so much about the perpetrators, not nearly enough, I think, in my opinion, about the women and the psychological impact on women who have experienced sexual harassment or sexual assault. What happens to these women psychologically?
There is a definite scar that can last for life if they don't get intensive psychotherapy. They feel belittled. They feel unseen, they disrespected, of course. They feel that their ability or their value of being a woman was totally robbed from them. It's kind of like rape victims, even if their sexual harassment doesn't include rape. It's like that in that they get depressed, they get anxious, they sometimes have PTSD, depending upon, how severe the harassment was. And so these are things, and these things affect the rest of their life. It affects their relationships with men. A lot of times these women, if they're married, they get divorced, or they, don't go out with men. They stop going out with men. It affects, they think all men are going to see them, first of all, as spoiled, tarnished, and that men will just be using them like this perpetrator.
Wow. Okay, we got to leave it there. But thank you so much, Dr. Liberman and Dr. Turner. Always good to see you. Great insights. So much going on in this case and so many others. We're going to obviously continue to follow what happens with the governor. But lots of progress have been made since 1991 when Anita Hill, had the courage to step forward and tell her story and her horrible experiences with who is now a U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Clarence Thomas. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Liberman and Dr. Turner. Just want to say thanks to all of my guests today. These topics are always difficult. Talking about